Sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, you need to change the topic. Maybe something that was said suddenly reminds you of something else that you want to say. Well, if that's happened to you, then you've come to the right podcast. In situations like these, we have a few short, natural phrases that gently guide the conversation in a new direction. And that's what this podcast English lesson is all about.
Welcome to another Happy English podcast coming to you from New York City. And here's your English teacher, Michael.
All right, thank you, John, and thanks, everyone. It's Michael here from Happy English, and I help people speak English better. And this is Happy English Podcast, episode 987. How to change the topic politely in English. Today, we're going to look at 4 very natural conversation phrases that you can use to change the topic of a conversation midway, while keeping the tone of the conversation smooth, polite, and friendly. Let's start with "that reminds me." We use "that reminds me" when the current topic makes us think of something related but not exactly the same thing. It's a gentle and thoughtful way to shift the conversation. For example, if your partner asks, "What do you want to have for dinner tonight?" You might say, "Oh, that reminds me, we're almost out of olive oil." Cooking made you remember something connected, so the topic change feels natural. Or if a coworker says, "I'm taking Friday off next week," you could respond, "Oh, that reminds me, are you free to meet on Thursday instead?" You can also use "that reminds me" in everyday conversation, like when you're talking to a friend about traveling, and suddenly you remember something important. You might say, "That reminds me, I still need to renew my passport." "That reminds me" sounds polite and natural, and it tells the listener that the topic change makes sense. Now, let's look at "speaking of." We use "speaking of" when the new topic is clearly and directly connected to what was just said. The connection is usually stronger than with "that reminds me." For example, if your coworker says, "Isn't the CEO coming next week?" you might say, "Yes, he is. And speaking of next week, we have a team meeting on Tuesday." The time reference makes the connection clear. Or if someone says, "I watched a really good movie last night," you could say, "Speaking of movies, have you seen the new Frankenstein movie on Netflix?" You may also hear this in casual conversation, like when a friend says, "I'm trying to save some money these days," and you reply, "Hey, speaking of saving money, I found a really cheap but good diner last weekend. We should go." "Speaking of" works best when the listener can easily follow the connection between the two topics. Next up is "by the way." We use "by the way" when we want to add something extra or change the topic quickly, even if it's not strongly connected to what we were talking about before. For example, if you're talking with a coworker about a project and suddenly remember something important, you might say, "By the way, did you send the report to the accounting department?" Or when you're chatting with a friend about weekend plans, you might add, "By the way, I heard Jack is having a party this weekend. Did you know?" You can also use "by the way" for small, polite additions to a conversation, especially when you suddenly remember something. Like, "Oh, by the way, thanks for your help yesterday." By the way is very common in spoken English, but it's best used lightly so the conversation doesn't feel jumpy. The last one is before I forget. We use before I forget when something suddenly pops into our head and we want to say it right away, before we forget. It's a polite way to interrupt or change the topic without sounding rude. For example, if you're talking with a coworker about a project and suddenly remember something important, you might say, before I forget, can you send me the file from yesterday? Or in a casual conversation with a friend, you could say, before I forget, I wanted to tell you that I bumped into Jenny at the deli the other day. You can also use it at the end of a conversation, like, before I forget, don't forget to bring your ID tomorrow. Before I forget sounds natural and helpful, and it lets the listener know you're interrupting for a good reason. So, let's put these together. We use, that reminds me, when the new topic is loosely connected. We use speaking of when the connection is clear and direct. We use by the way when we're adding something extra or switching topics quickly. And finally, we use before I forget when we suddenly remember something important that we wanted to say. All 4 of these phrases can help you change the topic politely and naturally without stopping the conversation or sounding rude. One important tip to remember is that native speakers usually don't explain why they're changing the topic. We just use one of these phrases and keep talking. That's what makes conversation sound smooth and natural. So, try using them in your English conversations this week. That's how you build real fluency. And keep in mind, the best way to remember English like this and any other word or phrase in English is to take that word or phrase, write it in a sentence that's true for you or true in your world, and then memorize your sentences. Hey, thanks for listening. And remember, learning another language is not easy, but it's not impossible. And I'm here to help you on your journey.
This podcast was brought to you by Happy English. Please visit myhappyenglish.com. Show your support for Happy English by leaving us a review. Get English, get happy, Happy English.